The bullet struck the saloon sign just above Barrett Brennan's head, and he didn't even flinch, just kept walking with that same heavy stride that made folks step aside without him having to ask. It was August 1877 in Quartz Hill, California, a mining town clinging to the edge of desperation where gold dust still drew men with more greed than sense. And Barrett had seen enough violence in his 32 years that a stray shot barely registered anymore. His face was all hard angles and sun-weathered skin, eyes the color of storm clouds that hadn't softened in so long he figured they never would again. People whispered about him in doorways and behind cupped hands at the general store, wondering what had happened to make a man so thoroughly joyless. But Barrett never gave them the satisfaction of an answer. He pushed through the doors of the Lucky Strike saloon, his spurs scraping against the warped floorboards, and the usual crowd parted like the Red Sea. The piano player hit a sour note and then recovered, continuing his off-key rendition of something that might have once been a hymn. Barrett ordered whiskey from Sam, the bartender who had learned years ago not to attempt small talk, and took his drink to the corner table where he could watch the room with his back to the wall. This was his routine, had been for the better part of 5 years since he had drifted into Quartz Hill with nothing but a horse, a bedroll, and a silence so complete it seemed to have weight. The ranch he worked on, the Double Diamond, was 3 miles outside of town, owned by an aging cattleman named Dutch Montgomery who appreciated that Barrett could break horses, mend fences, and go entire weeks without saying more than a handful of words. The other ranch hands gave him space, sharing their beans and coffee around the campfire while Barrett ate his portion away from the circle of firelight, and nobody questioned it anymore. He was good at his work, better than good, and in a place like Quartz Hill, competence mattered more than congeniality. Barrett was halfway through his second whiskey when the commotion started outside. Raised voices, a woman's shout, and then the sound of something heavy hitting the dirt. He should have stayed in his seat, should have finished his drink and minded his own business like he always did. But something about that voice, high and furious rather than frightened, made him set down his glass and walk back out into the scorching afternoon heat. The street was a tableau of trouble. A wagon had lost a wheel, its contents spilled across the rutted road, barrels and crates lying on their sides while a team of horses stamped nervously in their traces. And there, in the middle of it all, stood a woman with copper-colored hair coming loose from its pins, her traveling dress dusty and torn at the hem, arguing with 3 men who clearly thought they could help themselves to whatever they wanted from her overturned cargo. "I said no," she declared, and there was steel in her voice despite the way her hands trembled slightly. "Those supplies belong to the schoolhouse, and you'll keep your hands off them or I'll see you answer to Marshal Dawson." One of the men laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Marshall's out of town, sweetheart, and seems to me that property lying in the street is fair game for salvage." Barrett recognized them now, the Cutler brothers and their cousin, mean drunks who worked odd jobs when they weren't causing trouble. The biggest one, Jake Cutler, reached for a crate marked with careful lettering, and that was when the woman did something that surprised everyone watching. She picked up a length of broken barrel stave and swung it at his hand hard enough that the crack echoed off the false-fronted buildings. Jake yelped and jerked back, his face going red with rage. "You little witch, I'll teach you." "No, you won't." Barrett's voice cut through the tension like a blade, low and flat and absolutely certain. He hadn't meant to speak, hadn't meant to get involved, but his feet had carried him forward anyway. And now he stood between the woman and the Cutlers, his hand resting easy on the gun at his hip. The brothers knew him by reputation if not by conversation. Jake's face went through several complicated expressions before settling on sullen anger. "This isn't your concern, Brennan. It is now." Barrett didn't elaborate, didn't explain, just stood there with that immovable quality he had, like a boulder that had been there since the mountains were young. After a long moment, Jake spat in the dirt, muttered something obscene, and jerked his head at his brothers. They slouched away down the street, casting dark looks over their shoulders, and Barrett knew he had just made enemies. Not that it mattered much. He'd had enemies before. When he turned back to the woman, she was staring at him with eyes the color of amber, wide and bright in her dirt-smudged face. She couldn't have been more than 23 or 24, young but not foolishly so, with a straight-backed posture that suggested she wasn't accustomed to backing down. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was steadier now, though he could see the adrenaline still coursing through her in the rapid pulse at her throat. "I'm Olivia Porter. I arrived this morning to take up the teaching position at the schoolhouse, and I've made a spectacular mess of my first day, it seems." Barrett grunted, which was about as close to "you're welcome" as he generally got, and crouched down to examine the broken wagon wheel. The axle was cracked clean through, probably from hitting one of the deeper ruts that plagued the main street when the winter rains came. It would need proper repair at the blacksmith shop, not a field fix. "You're Barrett Brennan," Olivia said, and it wasn't a question. "Sam at the saloon pointed you out when I asked who might be able to help with heavy work. He said you were the strongest man in town, though he also said you'd likely refuse to help because you prefer to be left alone." She paused, then added with a slight smile that transformed her whole face, "He wasn't wrong about the second part, was he?" Barrett stood, dusting off his hands on his worn denim pants. He should walk away now. Should go back to his whiskey and his corner table, and leave Miss Olivia Porter to find some other solution to her wagon problem. But the sun was beating down mercilessly, and those supplies really did look like schoolbooks and slates and things too valuable to leave sitting in the street while she figured things out. And somehow he found himself saying, "I'll get the wagon to Anderson's shop. You gather what you can carry." Relief flooded her expression, but she didn't gush with gratitude the way he'd expected. Instead, she just nodded briskly and started collecting the scattered items, moving with efficient purpose. Barrett unhitched the nervous horses, calming them with steady hands and low words that no human in town had heard him use in years. And then he recruited 2 boys playing marbles on the sidewalk to help him drag the broken wagon down to the blacksmith's. By the time he returned, Olivia had organized everything into neat piles, sorted by type and urgency. She had also somehow acquired a wheelbarrow from the mercantile, and she was loading it with books when Barrett approached. "The schoolhouse is that white building at the end of Oak Street, correct?" she asked, shading her eyes against the sun to look up at him. "Mr. Anderson said it would take 3 days to fix the wagon properly, so I suppose I'll be making several trips." Barrett considered this. The schoolhouse was a good quarter-mile away, and the heat was only getting worse as the afternoon wore on. He could leave her to it, should leave her to it, but instead he heard himself say, "I'll bring the horses back with a pack saddle. Make it easier." And that was how Barrett Brennan, who hadn't volunteered for anything in half a decade, spent his afternoon hauling school supplies across Quartz Hill with the new teacher. Olivia didn't chatter at him constantly, which he appreciated, but she also didn't act like his silence was something to tiptoe around. She talked when she had something to say, pointing out which crates needed to be handled carefully because they contained bottles of ink, or mentioning that she'd come all the way from Sacramento after answering an advertisement for the position. "I grew up in Boston originally," she said as they made their third trip, leading one of the horses laden with carefully balanced loads. But my parents brought me west when I was 16, seeking better opportunities. My father works for the railroad now, surveying new routes, and my mother runs a boarding house. They think I'm mad for wanting to teach in a small mining town, but I like the idea of being somewhere I can make a real difference, somewhere that needs what I have to offer. Barrett didn't respond, but he also did not listen, which was perhaps its own form of encouragement. The schoolhouse was a simple structure, newly whitewashed, with windows that actually had glass in them, a luxury in a town like Quartz Hill. Inside, it was a single large room with rows of rough-hewn benches, a proper chalkboard, and a pot-bellied stove for when autumn came, and the mountain air turned cold. Olivia moved through the space with visible pleasure, touching the teacher's desk, straightening the benches, already planning in her head how she would arrange things. "School starts in 2 weeks," she said. "I'll have 23 students ages 6 to 14 all in one room. Some of them can't read at all yet, and a few of the older ones are apparently quite advanced. It will be a challenge, but I'm ready for it." Barrett set down the last crate of supplies and straightened, his back protesting slightly. He was aware that he'd spent far more time on this task than necessary, that he could have left after the first load or simply pointed her in the right direction and gone back to his usual evening at the Double Diamond. But the sun was starting to sink toward the mountains now, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and Olivia was standing in the middle of her new schoolhouse with dust on her cheek and hope in her eyes, and something about the picture made his chest feel tight in a way he didn't have words for. "Thank you, Mr. Brennan," Olivia said softly, meeting his gaze directly. "Truly. I don't know what I would have done without your help today." Barrett nodded once, touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of farewell, and turned to leave. He made it all the way to the door before her voice stopped him. "I'm staying at Mrs. Chen's boarding house, if you ever want to stop by for coffee or conversation." There was something tentative in her tone, but also bold, like she knew she was taking a chance and had decided it was worth the risk. "I get the sense you're not much for conversation, but the offer stands all the same." He didn't answer, just kept walking, leading the horses back toward the livery stable where he'd board them for the night before heading out to the ranch. But as he rode through the gathering dusk, the rhythm of his horses' hooves steady beneath him, Barrett found himself thinking about amber eyes and a voice that didn't waver, even when it should have. He told himself it didn't matter, that by morning he'd have filed the whole encounter away in the same mental space where he kept every other brief, meaningless interaction with the people of Quartz Hill. He was wrong about that, but he wouldn't realize it for several more days. The following week passed in its usual pattern. Barrett rose before dawn, worked until his muscles ached and his mind went blessedly quiet, ate his solitary meals, and lay on his bedroll staring at the stars until sleep took him. Dutch Montgomery complimented him on the new corral fence he'd built, which was as close to effusive praise as the old man got, and the other ranch hands continued their practice of treating Barrett like a piece of furniture, present but not requiring acknowledgement. It should have been enough. It had been enough for years now, this careful isolation, this deliberate numbness. Barrett had learned that feeling nothing was infinitely preferable to feeling everything, and he'd built his whole life around maintaining that state. But now, for reasons he refused to examine too closely, he found his thoughts drifting at odd moments to a copper-haired woman who'd swung a piece of wood at 3 men without a hint of fear. On Saturday, he rode into town for supplies, as was his custom. The mercantile was busy with weekend shoppers, families stocking up for the week ahead, Men in from the mines spending their wages on tobacco and candy and small luxuries. Barrett moved through the crowd like a ghost, picking up the items on his list: coffee, beans, salt, tobacco for rolling cigarettes, and paying in silence while the clerk counted out his change. He was tying his purchases to his saddle when he heard it. Laughter, bright and genuine, coming from across the street. He looked up despite himself and saw Olivia Porter standing outside the boarding house, talking with Mrs. Chen, and they were both laughing at something, their faces alight with amusement. Barrett couldn't remember the last time he'd heard laughter that sounded so free, so unguarded, and certainly couldn't remember the last time he'd made such a sound himself. Years, he thought. It had been years. Not since before, in that life he didn't let himself think about anymore, with people he couldn't afford to remember. Olivia looked up then, as if she'd felt his gaze, and her expression shifted when she saw him. Not fearful, not wary, but pleased. She raised a hand in greeting, said something quick to Mrs. Chen, and then crossed the street toward him with a purposeful stride that suggested she'd been hoping to run into him. "Mr. Brennan," she said warmly, "I was hoping I might see you. I wanted to invite you to the schoolhouse social next Friday evening. I'm hosting it as a way to meet the families of my students before school begins, and I thought you might enjoy it." Barrett stared at her, genuinely baffled. "I don't have children." "No, but you helped me when I needed it, and I consider you a friend." She said it simply, as if friendship was a thing that could be declared unilaterally, without his consent or participation. "Besides, there will be food, and Mrs. Patterson is bringing her famous apple pie, which I'm told is reason enough to attend any event in Quartz Hill." He should refuse. Should tell her plainly that he wasn't the socializing type, that she'd be better off directing her friendliness elsewhere. But Olivia was looking at him with those bright amber eyes, hopeful but not desperate, and the word that came out was, maybe. Her smile could have lit the whole town. "Maybe is good enough. 7 o'clock if you change your mind." She left him standing there, slightly stunned by his own response, and walked back to the boarding house with a spring in her step. Barrett finished tying down his supplies and rode back to the Double Diamond in a state of confused irritation, angry at himself for not being firmer, for leaving the door open even a crack. But when Friday came, he found himself washing up more carefully than usual, putting on his one good shirt, the blue one without any stains or frayed cuffs, and riding into town just as the sun started to set. He told himself he was just going to see if she really could pull off a social event in 2 weeks, that he'd stay for a few minutes out of politeness, and then leave. The schoolhouse was transformed. Someone had strung paper lanterns from the ceiling beams, and the evening light filtering through the windows gave everything a golden glow. Families had brought dishes to share, covering the teacher's desk with a feast of fried chicken, biscuits, roasted vegetables, pies, and cakes. Children ran around shrieking with laughter while their parents talked in small clusters, and Olivia moved through it all like a conductor leading an orchestra, greeting everyone, remembering names, making connections. She spotted Barrett hovering near the door, clearly debating escape, and swooped in before he could flee. "You came," she said, and her delight was so genuine it made something crack in the wall he'd built around himself. "Come in, please. Let me introduce you around." "I don't need introductions," Barrett protested, but she'd already linked her arm through his and was guiding him toward the food table. "Everyone needs introductions," Olivia countered. "It's how we become part of a community instead of just existing adjacent to it." For the next hour, Barrett found himself pulled into conversations he didn't want to have with people he'd been successfully avoiding for years. But Olivia had a gift for making connections feel natural, for drawing people out without them realizing they were being drawn. She mentioned to Tom Patterson that Barrett was excellent with horses, which led to a discussion about training methods. She told Mary Hutchins that Barrett had fixed her wagon situation, which led to Mary asking his opinion on a stuck gate at her property. And slowly, despite his best intentions, Barrett found himself responding, not with long speeches or elaborate stories, but with simple, straightforward answers that seemed to satisfy people. The tension in his shoulders eased incrementally, and when someone handed him a plate of food, he discovered he was actually hungry. The real shift came later in the evening, when most of the families had left, and only a handful of people remained to help clean up. Olivia was washing dishes in a bucket of soapy water, sleeves rolled up to her elbows, while Barrett dried them with a cloth that had seen better days. The schoolhouse was quiet now except for the soft splash of water and the distant sound of voices from the street. "You didn't have to stay to help," Olivia said, glancing at him sideways, "but I'm glad you did." Barrett shrugged, concentrating on drying a plate more thoroughly than necessary. "Seemed wrong to leave you with all the work. Most people wouldn't have thought twice about it." She handed him another plate, her fingers brushing his briefly. "You're not like most people, Barrett Brennan. I figured that out the first day we met." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, which seemed to be the right response because Olivia continued. "People in town talk about you, you know. They say you never smile, never laugh, never seem to enjoy anything. They wonder what made you so serious." She paused, then added quietly, "But I don't think serious is the right word. I think you're sad. And I think you've been sad for so long you've forgotten there's any other way to be." The plate nearly slipped from Barrett's hands. No one had ever said anything like that to him before, had ever looked at him closely enough to see past the gruff exterior to what lay beneath. He wanted to deny it, to tell her she was wrong, that she didn't know anything about him, but the words stuck in his throat because they would have been lies, and he'd never been any good at lying. "I'm sorry," Olivia said when he didn't respond. "That was presumptuous of me. Your life is your own business, and I have no right to make assumptions." "It's not an assumption if it's true." Barrett's voice came out rougher than he'd intended, scraping like gravel. He set down the plate and the cloth, his hands suddenly needing something to do. "I had a family once, a wife, a son. They died of fever 7 years ago, and I couldn't save them, couldn't do a damn thing except watch them slip away." The silence that followed felt enormous, pressing down on them from all sides. Barrett had never said those words out loud before, not to anyone, and now that they were out in the open, he felt stripped bare, vulnerable in a way that made him want to run. But Olivia didn't offer empty platitudes or meaningless comfort. She just dried her hands on her apron, stepped closer, and placed one hand gently on his arm. The touch was light, barely there, but it anchored him somehow, kept him from spiraling into the dark places his memories wanted to take him. "I'm so sorry," she said, and the words were simple but weighted with genuine compassion. "That kind of loss, it changes everything, doesn't it? Makes the world feel dangerous and unpredictable. Makes it feel pointless," Barrett corrected quietly. "I spent years building something, a life, a future, and it all disappeared in the space of a week. After that, it seemed easier not to build anything at all, not to want anything or care about anything, because caring just gives the world something to take away from you." Olivia nodded slowly, her hand still resting on his arm. "That makes sense. It's logical in a terrible sort of way." She tilted her head, studying his face in the lantern light. "But Barrett, existing isn't the same as living, and I think somewhere deep down you know that." He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, that he was fine with his half-life of work and silence and deliberate isolation. But standing there in the quiet schoolhouse with Olivia Porter looking at him like he was someone worth seeing, worth knowing, Barrett felt something shift inside him. A crack in the ice he'd wrapped around himself, small but significant. "I don't know how to be any other way anymore," he admitted, and it felt like the most honest thing he'd said in years. "Then maybe you could learn," Olivia suggested gently. "Not all at once, and not because you have to, but because you might want to. Because joy and connection and yes, even laughter, those things are still possible, even after terrible loss." Barrett looked at her, really looked, and saw not pity in her eyes but understanding and something else he couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or possibility. And for the first time in 7 years, he allowed himself to consider that she might be right. The next few weeks passed differently than any time Barrett could remember since settling in Quartz Hill. It started small. He accepted Olivia's invitation to help repair some loose shingles on the schoolhouse roof, and then stayed when she offered him coffee afterward. They sat on the schoolhouse steps in the late afternoon sun, not talking much but not maintaining the rigid silence Barrett usually insisted upon either. Olivia told him about her students, the progress they were making, the challenges of teaching such a wide range of ages and abilities. Barrett listened, occasionally offering a thought or observation, and discovered that conversation wasn't as painful as he'd remembered. A few days later, Olivia showed up at the Double Diamond Ranch looking for Barrett, which caused no small amount of surprise among the other ranch hands. She brought a basket with fresh bread and jam, a thank you, she said, for all his help, and asked if he might have time to teach her to ride properly since her experience was limited to gentle carriage horses. Dutch Montgomery, who had been watching this exchange with undisguised interest, practically ordered Barrett to take the time, offering up his gentlest mare for the purpose. So Barrett found himself giving riding lessons in the early evenings when the worst heat had passed, but there was still enough light to see by. He taught Olivia how to sit properly, how to communicate with the horse through subtle shifts of weight and pressure, how to move with the animal rather than against it. She was a quick learner, fearless but not reckless, and she laughed when she made mistakes instead of getting frustrated. That laugh, Barrett discovered, did something to him. It loosened something in his chest that had been clenched tight for so long he'd forgotten it could relax. And one evening, when Olivia's horse shied at a jackrabbit, and she managed to stay seated through a series of hopping sideways steps, whooping with surprised delight when she regained control, Barrett felt his mouth curve upward. It was barely a smile, just the slightest lift at the corners, but Olivia saw it. Her eyes went wide and she reined in her horse, staring at him like he'd just performed a miracle. "Was that a smile?" she asked, wonder in her voice. Barrett's face immediately reverted to its usual stern expression. "No, it was," Olivia insisted, grinning now. "Barrett Brennan, you just smiled at me. I saw it with my own eyes." "You saw wrong," he grumbled, but there was no heat in it. And when Olivia laughed again, delighted by her discovery, Barrett found his mouth twitching traitorously toward another almost smile. "This is a momentous occasion," Olivia declared, walking her horse alongside his as they headed back toward the ranch buildings. "The day the gruffest cowboy in Quartz Hill remembered how to smile. I should mark it on a calendar." "You're making too much of this," Barrett protested, but he didn't actually mind her teasing. It felt warm somehow, affectionate rather than mocking, and he realized with a start that he was enjoying himself. Actually enjoying spending time with another person, something he'd thought was beyond him now. As September deepened and October approached, Barrett and Olivia fell into a pattern of spending time together several evenings a week. Sometimes he helped her with tasks around the schoolhouse, fixing a stubborn window or organizing the woodpile for winter. Sometimes they rode together, Olivia's skills improving steadily until she could handle most terrain with confidence. And sometimes they just talked, sitting on her porch at the boarding house or walking through town as the sun set, and Barrett found himself telling her things he'd never told anyone. About his life before the tragedy, the small farm he'd owned, the dreams he'd had for his son's future. About the guilt that still gnawed at him sometimes, the irrational but persistent feeling that he should have been able to do something, anything, to change the outcome. Olivia listened without judgment, offering perspective when he needed it and silence when he didn't. She shared her own stories too, about growing up in Boston, about the death of her younger brother from scarlet fever when she was 19, about how that loss had shaped her decision to become a teacher, to make a difference in children's lives as a way of honoring the child she'd lost. "We carry our grief with us," she said one evening as they sat on a bench outside the Mercantile, watching the stars emerge one by one. "It becomes part of who we are, part of the shape of our lives, but it doesn't have to be the only thing we are. There's room for grief and joy to coexist, strange as that sounds." Barrett considered this, turning the idea over in his mind. "I'm not sure I know how to do that." "You're already doing it," Olivia pointed out gently. "You're here with me, aren't you, having a conversation, sharing stories." "That's not nothing, Barrett. That's you choosing to live again, even if it's just in small ways." He wanted to tell her it wasn't that simple, that she was giving him too much credit, but the truth was that she was right. Something was different now. The weight he'd been carrying for 7 years felt lighter, more bearable, and the numbness he'd cultivated so carefully was giving way to something else, something that felt dangerously like hope. It was mid-October when Barrett finally laughed, really laughed, for the first time in so long he genuinely couldn't remember the last occasion. They were at the schoolhouse on a Saturday afternoon, and Olivia had recruited him to help build a bookshelf for the growing library collection. She was holding one end of a board while Barrett hammered, and she was telling him about a mishap from her first week of teaching where a student had smuggled a frog into class, and it had escaped, causing absolute chaos. "And then," Olivia said, barely able to get the words out through her own laughter, "the frog jumped right into Mrs. Patterson's basket when she came to collect her daughter, and she didn't notice until she got home and opened it to put away the leftover lunch, and she screamed so loud they heard it 3 houses away." The image was too vivid, too ridiculous, and Barrett felt something bubble up in his chest, something he'd thought was dead. It started as a chuckle, low and rusty from disuse, and then became a full laugh, his shoulders shaking with it. The hammer slipped from his grip, clattering to the floor, and he bent forward slightly, overcome by the unfamiliar sensation. When he finally caught his breath and looked up, Olivia was staring at him with an expression of pure joy, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "There you are," she whispered. "The man underneath all that armor. I knew he was in there somewhere." Barrett's laughter faded, but the lightness remained, and he realized his face hurt slightly in an unfamiliar way. It took him a moment to recognize the feeling. His cheeks were sore from smiling. He couldn't remember the last time he'd smiled enough for it to ache. "I can't remember," he said quietly, honestly. "The last time I laughed like that. It's been so long, Olivia." She crossed the space between them, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her amber eyes, could smell the faint scent of lavender soap she used. "Then I'm honored to have been here for it," she said softly. "To witness you finding your way back to joy, even if it's just for a moment." Barrett reached out before he could second-guess the impulse, tucking a loose strand of copper hair behind her ear. His hand lingered there, rough fingertips against the soft skin of her cheek, and Olivia's breath caught. The air between them felt charged, heavy with possibility, and Barrett knew with sudden absolute certainty that he was falling in love with this woman. Had probably been falling since the moment she'd stood in the street and refused to back down, since she'd seen past his walls to the broken man beneath, and decided he was worth knowing anyway. "Olivia," he said, her name rough in his mouth but weighted with everything he felt and couldn't yet say. "Yes." She leaned into his touch slightly, and Barrett could see his own feelings reflected in her eyes, hope and want and the tentative beginning of love. "I'm not good at this," he warned. "At being with someone, at opening up. I've spent so long keeping everyone at a distance that I'm not sure I remember how to do anything else." "Then we'll figure it out together," Olivia said simply. "I'm not asking for perfection, Barrett. I'm just asking for honesty for you to try. Can you do that?" He nodded slowly, and then, before his courage could fail, he leaned down and kissed her. It was tentative at first, almost questioning, but when Olivia's arms came up to wrap around his neck, and she kissed him back with enthusiasm, something inside Barrett came fully back to life. The kiss deepened, became more confident, and when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Barrett rested his forehead against hers and allowed himself to feel the full weight of what was happening. He was falling in love. After 7 years of deliberate emptiness, of refusing to feel anything at all, he was falling completely and irrevocably in love with Olivia Porter, and the terror of that was matched only by the fierce joy of it. "I care about you," he said, because love felt too big to say yet, too dangerous. "More than I thought I'd ever care about anyone again." Olivia's smile was radiant. "I care about you too. So much, Barrett. You're everything I didn't know I was looking for." They stood there in the half-finished schoolhouse, surrounded by sawdust and tools and the golden afternoon light, and Barrett felt the last of his carefully constructed walls crumble. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, this vulnerability, this opening of himself to the possibility of loss again. But as he held Olivia close and felt her heart beating against his chest, Barrett decided that some risks were worth taking. That a life lived in fear of loss wasn't really living at all. The months that followed were a revelation. Barrett courted Olivia properly, or as properly as a cowboy knew how, which meant wildflowers left on her porch, rides through the mountains to watch the sunset, and long conversations that stretched into the evening. The people of Quartz Hill watched this transformation with fascination, hardly able to believe that Barrett Brennan was the same man who'd spent years as the town's resident ghost, present but not participating. Dutch Montgomery took to teasing Barrett about being lovesick, which Barrett bore with surprising grace and the occasional genuine smile. The other ranch hands stopped treating him like furniture and started including him in their conversations, and Barrett found himself actually contributing, even sharing the occasional joke or story from his past. It was strange, this rejoining of the human race, but Olivia made it easier. She had a way of bringing out the best in people, of making them feel seen and valued, and under her influence, Barrett slowly became someone he barely recognized. By December, when the first snows dusted the peaks around Quartz Hill, Barrett knew with absolute certainty that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with Olivia Porter. The thought of proposing terrified him. What if she said no? What if he was moving too fast, assuming too much? But it also filled him with a bone-deep rightness that he couldn't ignore. He decided to do it on Christmas Eve. The schoolhouse was hosting a holiday celebration, and Olivia had been planning it for weeks, excited about the chance to create magic for her students. Barrett helped her decorate, hanging garlands of pine boughs and strings of popcorn, lighting candles in the windows, setting up the small tree that several families had donated. When the students and their families arrived, the schoolhouse was transformed into something out of a storybook, warm and glowing and filled with laughter. Barrett watched Olivia throughout the evening, saw her joy in bringing people together, in creating community and connection. She moved through the crowd in a blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, and every time she caught his gaze across the room, she smiled in a way that made his heart stutter. When the formal part of the celebration ended and families began to drift home, Barrett helped Olivia clean up, his nerves ratcheting higher with each passing minute. The ring he'd bought from the jeweler in Sacramento, a simple gold band with a small sapphire, felt like it was burning a hole in his pocket. He'd ridden all the way there specifically to find something worthy of her, and the jeweler had assured him it was a fine choice. But now Barrett worried it wasn't enough, that nothing could be enough for a woman like Olivia. Finally, when the schoolhouse was clean and quiet and they were the only ones left, Barrett took a deep breath and reached for Olivia's hand, pulling her toward the center of the room where they danced earlier to music from a fiddle player. "Olivia, I need to say something," he began, and his voice only shook slightly. "These past few months with you they've been the best time I've had since I lost everything. You made me remember what it feels like to be alive, to want things again. To laugh and smile and feel like the future might hold something good." Olivia's eyes were huge and shining, her hand tight in his. "Barrett, let me finish," he said gently. "Please, I'm not good with words and I need to get this out before I lose my nerve." He took another breath, steadying himself. "I love you. I'm in love with you, completely and terrifyingly, and I want to build a life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to support your teaching and raise a family if we're blessed that way and grow old watching sunsets from our porch. I want everything, Olivia, all of it, as long as it's with you." He dropped to one knee then, pulling the ring from his pocket with trembling fingers. "Olivia Porter, will you marry me?" The tears that had been threatening in Olivia's eyes spilled over, tracking down her cheeks as she nodded vigorously. "Yes," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Barrett, of course yes. I love you too, so much, and I can't imagine my future without you in it." Barrett slid the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, and then he was standing and she was in his arms, both of them laughing and crying at once, kissing with the kind of joy that comes from finding something precious you thought you'd lost forever. Outside, snow began to fall in soft white flakes, blanketing Quartz Hill in silence. And inside the schoolhouse, Barrett Brennan held the woman he loved and felt complete in a way he'd thought was impossible. They married in February of 1878, on a cold but brilliantly sunny day. The ceremony was held in the schoolhouse because it was the largest building in town that wasn't a saloon, and it seemed fitting somehow to begin their marriage in the place where they'd fallen in love. Most of Quartz Hill turned out for the occasion, packed into the benches that usually held students, watching as Barrett and Olivia exchanged vows in front of a traveling minister who made the rounds through the mountain towns. Barrett wore a new suit that Olivia had insisted on, dark wool that made his eyes look even more gray, and Olivia wore a dress of cream silk that she'd sewn herself, simple but elegant. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and told Barrett he could kiss his bride, Barrett didn't hesitate. He pulled Olivia close and kissed her thoroughly, not caring that half the town was watching, and the cheers and applause that erupted made him smile against her mouth. The reception was rowdy and joyful, with food and dancing and too much whiskey passing around among the men. Dutch Montgomery gave a rambling but heartfelt speech about how he'd never thought he'd see the day Barrett Brennan looked happy, but he was mighty glad to be proven wrong. Several of Olivia's students presented drawings they'd made of the bride and groom, which Olivia accepted with genuine delight and promised to frame. And as the evening wore on and the celebration continued, Barrett found himself in the center of it all rather than on the edges, laughing and talking and dancing with his wife, and it felt like coming home after a long, lonely journey. They moved into a small house on the edge of town, a simple two-room structure that had been empty for months but had good bones and a nice view of the mountains. Barrett spent his spare time fixing it up, repairing the roof, replacing broken windows, building furniture piece by piece. Olivia filled it with books and curtains and the kind of small touches that turned a house into a home, and by the time spring arrived, it was completely theirs. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Barrett continued working at the Double Diamond, though Dutch had offered him a promotion to foreman that came with better pay and more responsibility. Olivia taught her students, nurturing their minds and their spirits with equal dedication. In the evenings, they cooked together, cleaned together, sat on their small porch watching the sun set behind the mountains while they talked about their days and their dreams. Barrett discovered that marriage to Olivia was nothing like his first marriage had been, not because one was better than the other, but because they were simply different. Olivia challenged him in ways his first wife never had, pushed him to be more open, more present, more engaged with the world. She didn't let him retreat into silence when things got difficult, but she also knew when he needed space to process his thoughts. They fought occasionally, passionate disagreements about everything from how to spend money to whether they should expand the schoolhouse, but they always worked through it, always came back to each other with apologies and compromises, and Barrett was happy. Genuinely, thoroughly happy in a way that still surprised him sometimes when he stopped to think about it. He smiled easily now, laughed often, and even joked with the other ranch hands in ways that had been unthinkable a year ago. The shadow of his past loss never fully disappeared. He still thought about his first wife and son, still carried the grief of their deaths, but it no longer defined every moment of his existence. He'd learned that Olivia was right, that grief and joy could coexist, that honoring the past didn't mean refusing to embrace the future. In the fall of 1878, Olivia told Barrett she was pregnant, and the joy and terror that surged through him were so intense he thought his heart might burst from his chest. They talked about having children, both wanting them but Barrett admitting his fear that something would go wrong, that history would repeat itself. Olivia had been patient with those fears, understanding but firm in her belief that they couldn't let the past steal their future. Now, holding her hand and placing his palm gently against her still flat stomach, Barrett made a conscious choice to embrace hope instead of fear. "We're having a baby," he said, testing the words, and then a smile broke across his face. "We're having a baby." Olivia laughed at his wonder at the transformation of fear into joy playing out across his features. "We are. Next spring, the doctor thinks. April or May." "A spring baby," Barrett murmured, and then pulled Olivia into a careful hug, overwhelmed by the weight of this gift, this second chance at fatherhood. "I'll take care of you both. I promise, Olivia. Whatever you need, whatever I can do." "I know you will," she said simply, trusting him completely, and that trust was perhaps the greatest gift of all. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Barrett worried constantly despite Olivia's reassurances and the doctor's optimistic reports. He built a cradle with his own hands, sanding it until it was smooth as silk, and Olivia sewed tiny clothes and blankets, preparing their home for the new arrival. The women of Quartz Hill rallied around them, offering advice and hand-me-down baby items and the kind of practical support that Barrett had once scorned, but now accepted with gratitude. In April of 1879, on a warm afternoon when the wildflowers were just beginning to bloom across the hillsides, Olivia went into labor. Barrett had faced down outlaws and broken wild horses and survived the worst loss imaginable, but nothing in his life had prepared him for the terror of those hours. He wore a path in the floor of their small house while Mrs. Chen and the doctor attended to Olivia in the bedroom, and every cry of pain from his wife made him want to break down the door and demand they do something, anything, to help her. But when the baby's first wail finally cut through the air, thin and indignant, Barrett's knees went weak with relief. Mrs. Chen emerged a few minutes later, smiling widely, and told him he had a healthy son and that Olivia was tired but fine and asking for him. Barrett entered the bedroom on shaking legs and found Olivia propped up against the pillows, exhausted and glowing, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she'd made. She looked up when he approached, her eyes full of tears and joy. "Meet your son," she said softly, and carefully transferred the baby into Barrett's waiting arms. Barrett looked down at the tiny face, red and wrinkled and perfect, and felt something in his chest expand so much it hurt. This was his child, his son, a living, breathing miracle, and the love that crashed over him was so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. But woven through the love was something else, something he hadn't expected: peace. He'd been given another chance, a gift he didn't deserve but would cherish with everything he had. And in that moment, Barrett forgave himself for not being able to save his first family. He understood, finally, that some things were beyond anyone's control, and that carrying guilt for the uncontrollable was just another way of refusing to live. "What should we name him?" Olivia asked, watching her husband fall in love with their son. Barrett thought for a moment, then said, "James." "After your brother, if that's all right with you." Olivia's face crumpled, fresh tears spilling over. "That's perfect," she whispered. "James Brennan. Welcome to the world, little one." James turned out to be an easy baby, quick to smile and slow to fuss, and Barrett took to fatherhood with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone who remembered the grim, silent man he'd been just 2 years earlier. He doted on his son, rocking him to sleep, making ridiculous faces to coax out giggles, carrying him everywhere in a sling Olivia had fashioned so Barrett's hands were free for work. The other ranch hands teased him mercilessly about being soft, but Barrett just laughed and told them they were jealous. Life became fuller, richer, in ways Barrett had forgotten were possible. Olivia returned to teaching after a few months, bringing James with her to the schoolhouse where he napped in a basket while she conducted lessons. The students adored having a baby around, taking turns gently rocking the basket or singing to James when he fussed. Barrett continued at the Double Diamond, now foreman officially, and saved every penny he could toward buying their own small piece of land someday. By the time James was walking and talking, Barrett and Olivia had saved enough to put a down payment on 20 acres just outside town, with a creek running through it and enough flat land for a house and barn. They built slowly, carefully, doing much of the work themselves with help from friends and neighbors. It took 2 years, but by the spring of 1882, the Brennan family moved into their own home, a sturdy 3-bedroom house with a wide porch and windows that caught the morning sun. Olivia was pregnant again by then, and in November she gave birth to a daughter they named Catherine, after Barrett's mother. Catherine had her mother's copper hair and her father's gray eyes, and from the moment she entered the world howling her displeasure, it was clear she would be a force to be reckoned with. James, now 3, was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything and occasionally needing to be gently redirected when his help became a bit too enthusiastic. The years passed in a blur of work and joy and the thousand small moments that make up a life. Barrett built up a modest horse breeding operation on their land, developing a reputation for well-trained mounts that were steady and reliable. Olivia continued teaching, taking a few years off when the children were very small but returning once Catherine started school herself. They added to their family again in 1885. Twin boys they named Samuel and Daniel, who kept everyone on their toes with their boundless energy and penchant for mischief. Barrett, watching his children grow and his wife thrive, sometimes had to stop and marvel at how completely his life had transformed. He was 40 years old, with a wife he adored and 4 healthy children and a home he'd built with his own hands. He smiled easily now, laughed often, and was known throughout Quartz Hill as a good man, a fair man, someone you could count on in a crisis. The gruff, silent cowboy who'd once walked through town like a ghost was gone, replaced by someone engaged with life in all its messy, beautiful complexity. On a summer evening in 1890, Barrett and Olivia sat on their porch watching the sunset, just as they'd done countless times before. The children were inside, James now 11, and helping his siblings with their evening chores, and the ranch was quiet except for the distant sound of horses and the evening birdsong. Barrett held Olivia's hand, their fingers intertwined, and thought about how far they'd come from that day in August 1877 when a copper-haired woman had stepped off a wagon and changed his life forever. "What are you thinking about?" Olivia asked, catching the expression on his face. "How lucky I am," Barrett said simply. "How you saved me without even knowing you were doing it." Olivia leaned her head against his shoulder. "We saved each other, I think. You gave me a home and a family and a love I'd stopped believing was possible. You made me laugh and challenged me to be better and loved me even when I was difficult." "You're never difficult," Barrett protested, and Olivia laughed. "Liar. I'm difficult all the time and you know it." She lifted her head to look at him, her amber eyes warm in the fading light. "But that's what love is, isn't it? Choosing each other over and over again even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Barrett pulled her closer, kissing the top of her head. "I'd choose you every time," he said. "In every life, every version of the world, you're it for me, Olivia. You always will be." They sat there as the sun sank behind the mountains and the first stars appeared, wrapped in each other and in the life they'd built together. Inside the house, they could hear the children starting to argue about something, and Olivia sighed and started to rise to go referee, but Barrett gently tugged her back down. "Let them work it out," he said. "Another few minutes won't hurt." So they stayed, watching the sky deepen from gold to purple to indigo, and Barrett thought about the man he'd been 13 years ago. That man wouldn't have believed this future was possible, wouldn't have trusted that joy could follow sorrow, that love could bloom in the ruins of loss. But Olivia had shown him otherwise, had coaxed him back to life with patience and humor, and a stubborn refusal to let him hide in his grief forever. She'd made him laugh when he couldn't remember the last time he'd done so, and in doing so, she'd given him back himself. And Barrett, who had once thought his story was over, had learned that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with a first glance but with a second chance, not with perfection, but with 2 broken people choosing to heal together. He'd learned that happiness wasn't a betrayal of the past, but an honoring of it, a way of saying that the love he'd lost had taught him how to love again. As the years continued to roll forward, the Brennan family became a cornerstone of Quartz Hill. James grew into a thoughtful young man who inherited his father's way with horses and his mother's love of learning. Catherine proved to be as fierce and bright as everyone had predicted, eventually following her mother into teaching. The twins, Samuel and Daniel, were different as night and day despite their identical faces, one drawn to ranching and one to the law, but both inheriting their parents' fundamental decency. Barrett and Olivia grew old together, their hair going gray, their faces marking the years, but their love only deepening with time. They never took for granted what they'd built, never forgot how close Barrett had come to remaining lost in his grief forever. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Barrett gave Olivia a locket containing tiny photographs of their children, and she cried and kissed him and told him he was still the best thing that had ever happened to her. Even when I'm grumpy. He teased because even after all these years he still had his moments of withdrawal, times when the old shadows crept back in. Especially then, Olivia said firmly. Because even at your grumpiest, you're still you and you're still mine, and that's all that matters. Barrett held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her, feeling the steady beat of her heart, and knew that he was home in every sense that mattered. He traveled a long, dark road to get here, through loss and grief, and the slow, painful process of learning to hope again. But he'd made it. They'd made it together, and that was the greatest victory of all. When Barrett Brennan finally passed away in 1912 at the age of 67, surrounded by his wife and children, and a host of grandchildren he'd never expected to live to see, his last words were, "Thank you for making me laugh, Olivia. Thank you for bringing me back." And Olivia, holding his hand as he slipped away, smiled through her tears and whispered, "Thank you for letting me. Thank you for loving me back." The story of the gruff cowboy who'd never smiled at anyone until a copper-haired teacher made him laugh became local legend in Quartz Hill, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. But for those who'd known Barrett and Olivia, who'd witnessed their love story unfold across decades, it was simply the truth, a testament to the power of connection, the possibility of second chances, and the transformative nature of love that sees past the walls we build and reaches for the person underneath, no matter how deeply they've hidden themselves away.